People love talking about compound interest as if it's pure financial sorcery. Einstein is often credited with calling it the eighth wonder of the world. Nearly every wealth video brings it up within the opening minutes. Even parents tend to mention it the first time a savings account gets opened. But almost nobody tells you what it actually feels like in the beginning. For the first few years, compounding feels broken. You stay disciplined. You keep investing. You open your account expecting progress, and what you see is painfully unimpressive. You put in $500 every month, then look back and realize your actual gains for the entire year were maybe $80. That's less than a single month of contributions. The numbers don't feel magical, they feel insulting. Instead of momentum, it feels like a slow, frustrating trickle. That's when the doubt starts creeping in. You begin to wonder whether the whole idea has been overhyped. Maybe compound growth only looks amazing for people who already started with $100,000. Maybe for someone building from zero, it's just a nice story that sounds better than it works. At that pace, it feels like the snowball will never get big enough to matter. I used to think the same way. Then I learned about something called the 8-4-3 rule, and it changed the way I look at wealth building forever. It's a simple mathematical pattern, but once you understand it, your portfolio starts making a lot more sense. Because this is the truth most people miss. Compounding is not slow, it's backloaded. The biggest rewards are pushed into the later years, far beyond what you can see from the beginning. So if it feels like nothing is happening, that doesn't mean you're failing. It means you're judging the process from the worst possible position. Here's what I mean. The 8-4-3 rule shows how long it usually takes to hit one major investing milestone after another when contributions stay consistent. The first major milestone takes around 8 years. Reaching the next doubling takes only 4 more years. Then doubling again takes just 3 more. 8 years for the first piece, 4 years for the second, 3 years for the third. Your contribution amount never changes, but the timeline starts shrinking. That's the power of compound growth, and it explains why so many investors quit right before the process becomes exciting. Let's put real numbers on it. Imagine an investor putting away $10,000 each year, or about $833 per month, while earning an average annual return of 12%. That's a little above the long-term stock market average, but still realistic over a long enough timeline. He starts from zero. After 8 years of consistent investing, he has contributed $80,000 of his own money. The portfolio grows to roughly $123,000. That means compounding has added about $43,000. Solid progress, but nothing that feels life-changing. Over those 8 years, the gains equal roughly 53% of what he personally contributed. Now look at the next stage. 4 years later, at year 12, total contributions reach $120,000. The portfolio grows to about $241,000. In only 4 years, the account almost doubles. Now the gains from compounding have surged to $121,000, which means the portfolio has finally reached the point where growth has overtaken total contributions for the first time. Now, this is the crossover point, the moment your money begins working harder than you do. Then comes the part that feels almost unreal. 3 more years pass. At year 15, total contributions reach $150,000. The portfolio climbs to around $372,000. In that short 3-year stretch, the account adds more value than it produced in the entire first 8 years combined. 8 years to reach $123,000. 4 more years to reach $241,000. 3 more years to reach $372,000. The contribution amount stayed the same. The rate of return stayed the same. The only thing that changed was the size of the base doing the compounding, and that changes everything. That's the 8-4-3 rule. It isn't a trick, a shortcut, or some secret formula. It's simply what compound growth looks like when you measure it across real milestones. The second half of the journey creates dramatically more value per year than the first half ever could. Most people never experience that acceleration because they quit somewhere in the first 8 years. They see small gains, compare them to all the hype surrounding compound interest, and decide the math either doesn't work or only works for wealthy people. That's where most people fall apart. They stop investing. They pull money out for short-term spending. They never stay in the game long enough to reach the part of the curve where compounding finally becomes obvious. That's why the 8-4-3 rule is so powerful. It gives you a timeline. It tells you when the results are supposed to feel slow, when momentum should begin to show up, and when the real acceleration finally arrives. It turns compound interest from a fuzzy idea into a schedule you can mentally prepare for. To trust that schedule, you need to understand the math behind it. Compound growth follows an exponential curve, and exponential curves are difficult for people to believe in because they spend a long time looking almost flat before they suddenly turn upward with force. If you're standing in year 2 or year 3, the road ahead looks nearly level. The steep part is still too far away to see, so your brain makes a mistake. It assumes the future will keep looking like the present. It sees weak growth now and concludes the entire journey will stay weak forever. That conclusion is completely wrong. Exponential growth does not move in a straight line. It accelerates. Here's the part that matters most. In the early stage, your contributions do almost all the heavy lifting. If you're investing $10,000 a year and your portfolio is worth $30,000, then even a strong 12% return only adds $3,600. Your yearly contribution is still far bigger than the growth created by the portfolio itself. That's why progress feels painfully slow. Most of the movement is still coming from you. Then you move into the middle stage. At that point, contributions and returns start looking more equal. A $100,000 portfolio earning 12% produces $12,000 in growth while you contribute another $10,000. Now your money is finally carrying its share of the load. The progress begins to feel more visible because the account is no longer depending mostly on your deposits. Then comes the later stage where the whole game changes. A $300,000 portfolio earning 12% throws off $36,000 in annual growth while you still contribute the same $10,000. Now your money is doing more than 3 times the work you are. That's when growth begins to feel explosive. The sacrifices you made earlier finally start paying you back at a scale that feels impossible. That shift from contribution-driven growth to return-driven growth is exactly what the 8-4-3 rule is showing you. The first 8 years are slow because contributions dominate. The next 4 years are transitional because momentum starts building. The final 3 years become powerful because returns begin dominating the process. Once you understand that, the early years stop feeling like failure. If you look at your portfolio after 3 years and feel disappointed, you can remind yourself that you are still in the contribution-heavy phase. That is not a problem. That is exactly what the math says should be happening. The returns are not broken. They are simply too small relative to your ongoing deposits and your still limited portfolio base. Then when your annual gains start getting close to your annual contributions, you know you've entered the transition zone. The snowball is finally getting heavier. Compounding is no longer sitting quietly in the background. You are getting close to the bend in the curve where the process starts becoming visible. And once your annual returns move above your annual contributions, you've entered an entirely different stage. At that point, your biggest job is not to interfere. Don't withdraw. Don't panic. Don't sabotage the machine right when it begins doing its best work. Now think about how quickly the timeline starts compressing as the portfolio grows. At a 12% annual return, money roughly doubles every 6 years. But that statistic only tells part of the story because it ignores continued contributions. When you're investing consistently, the first doublings take longer because the starting amount is so small. The first $50,000 takes years because you're mostly building it yourself. The second $50,000 comes faster because returns are finally helping in a meaningful way. The third $50,000 comes faster still because the portfolio is now doing most of the lifting. By the time the account reaches $200,000, it can be producing $24,000 or more per year at 12% all by itself. Once your portfolio reaches that point, another $50,000 might take only a couple of years because the returns are now doing twice the work of your deposits. By the time the account grows to $500,000, it could be generating $60,000 or more per year on its own. At that stage, a $10,000 annual contribution barely moves the needle. The portfolio is effectively replacing your entire yearly deposit every 2 months through returns alone. That's why experienced investors often say the later years feel unfair. The numbers start climbing so quickly that it almost looks like a math error. But nothing is broken. This is simply what the far side of an exponential curve looks like once you finally arrive there. And that is exactly where so many people quit. Think about someone who invests steadily from age 25 to 33. He builds a portfolio of roughly $100,000 and then stops contributing. Maybe he got discouraged. Maybe life became expensive. Maybe he told himself he would make up for it later. If that $100,000 stays invested, it can still compound and potentially grow to around $310,000 by age 50 without another deposit. Now compare that with someone who kept investing through the transition years and into the return-dominated stage. That investor could reach $800,000 or more by the same age. The gap is not just about contributing extra money, it is about staying in the game long enough to benefit from the acceleration phase, where each new dollar gets amplified most powerfully by the compounding years ahead. The person who stopped gave up the exact leverage that makes the system extraordinary. To make this real, now imagine two investors who started at the same age and contributed the same amount. Daniel began investing at 27. He put in $800 every month, stayed consistent, and kept going through every market dip and recovery. After 8 years, at age 35, his portfolio had grown to around $115,000. It did not feel impressive. The people around him were buying houses, upgrading cars, and living more visibly comfortable lives while he kept sending money into an account that still felt small. But he understood how compounding worked, so he stayed the course. By year 12, at age 39, his portfolio had moved past $235,000. Something had clearly changed. His annual returns were now larger than his annual contributions. The account was starting to surprise him in a good way. For the first time, the momentum felt real. By year 15, at age 42, he had roughly $380,000. Those last 3 years added more value than the entire first 8 years combined. That was the moment the idea of compound growth stopped sounding theoretical. The payoff had become visible. Now compare that with Marcus. Marcus started at the same age and invested at the same rate, but after 5 years he lost conviction. His portfolio was sitting around $55,000 and the progress felt painfully slow. He looked at the numbers, projected them forward, and convinced himself he would be old before the results meant anything. So he stopped contributing and redirected that money into a more comfortable lifestyle. His $55,000 stayed invested and continued growing. By age 42, 15 years after he started, it had compounded into roughly $170,000. That is still respectable for money he had abandoned a decade earlier. But Daniel had $380,000. The difference was about $210,000. They began at the same time. They invested the same amount in the first 5 years. The only real difference was that one pushed through the frustrating early stage and the other walked away before the curve bent upward. That is why the 8-4-3 rule matters. It would have shown Marcus that the first 8 years were always going to feel underwhelming, that years 9 through 12 were where the acceleration became visible, and that years 13 through 15 were when the results would start looking extraordinary. With that map in front of him, he might have stayed patient enough to reach the part that changes everything. The 8-4-3 rule also explains why starting young matters so much, but in a more precise way than people usually describe. Now, most advice says to start early because you get more time in the market. That is true, but it is too vague. The 8-4-3 rule makes the advantage clearer. Starting earlier means you hit the acceleration phase while you are still young enough to benefit from it fully. Someone who begins at 25 is likely to reach that explosive stage around age 40. That gives him decades to enjoy the phase where returns do the heavy lifting. Someone who begins at 40 may not hit that explosive stretch until around 55, leaving far less time to fully benefit from the acceleration. The math is the same in both cases, but the person who starts earlier reaches the most powerful part of the curve when it can still transform a much larger portion of life. That said, this should not discourage anyone who starts late. Even if you begin at 45, the 8-4-3 pattern can still work in your favor. You can still reach the stage where growth from returns overtakes the money you personally contribute. You just need to understand something critical in advance. The first 8 years are still going to feel slower than you want, and you have to keep going anyway. There is also a mental hurdle that ruins a lot of investors in those early years. When the portfolio is still small, volatility feels personal. You spend an entire year contributing $10,000 only to watch the market fall 8% and wipe out most of what looked like progress. It feels like you are pushing uphill on a treadmill that keeps dragging you backward. That reaction is understandable, but it is also misleading. In the contribution-heavy stage, market declines are not purely bad news. Lower prices mean every deposit buys more shares. Those extra shares can sit there compounding for years, sometimes decades, if you leave them alone. The investors who built serious wealth were often the ones who kept buying during ugly periods like 2008 and 2009, when assets were deeply discounted. They were also the ones who refused to panic in 2020. When fear spiked and the market recovered faster than most expected. They understood something most people miss. Volatility during accumulation is often an advantage, not a defect. Later on, when returns dominate and the portfolio base is much larger, volatility carries more emotional weight. A 10% decline on a $500,000 account is a $50,000 swing, which can easily outweigh years of new contributions. That is when discipline, diversification, and emotional control matter even more. But earlier in the journey, volatility can actually work for you. It creates cheaper entry points. It allows you to collect more shares while prices are down, and every share purchased during a downturn can become part of the acceleration you experience years later. If you learn to see volatility this way, the slow years become easier to survive. A stagnant portfolio in a falling market is not always lost progress. In many cases, it is discounted future wealth. Now let's turn the 8-4-3 rule into something practical. Start by estimating your own timeline. Think about when you began investing seriously and consistently. If you are only 3 years in and already frustrated, remember that you have not even made it halfway through the first stage. That slow pace is not a warning sign. It is exactly what the mathematics of compounding would predict. Next, figure out which phase you are in right now. Compare your yearly returns with your yearly contributions. If your contributions are still bigger, you are in the early accumulation phase. If the two numbers are getting close, you are moving through the transition zone. If your returns are now larger than what you contribute, you have entered the acceleration phase. Then adjust your expectations accordingly. In the early stage, what matters most is increasing or maintaining your contribution rate because your behavior matters more than your returns when the base is still small. In the transition stage, consistency becomes everything because interruptions become more damaging right as momentum starts showing up. In the acceleration stage, your main job is simple. Stop getting in the way. You can also use the 8-4-3 framework to set meaningful milestones. Someone starting from zero today might aim for $150,000 in year 8, $300,000 in year 12, and $450,000 or more by year 15. Those targets help you think in terms of natural acceleration instead of expecting steady linear progress. And maybe most importantly, stop judging your position only by where you are today. The person standing in year 3 sees only modest progress. But that same person looking ahead to year 15 sees a completely different reality. One perspective kills motivation, the other sustains it. Focus on where the curve is going, not just where it is now. There is also another layer to the 8-4-3 rule that almost never gets enough attention. It does not only apply to investments, it also applies to other systems that compound over time, including income. Careers often follow the same compounding pattern. The first 8 years of a career are usually spent building skill, reputation, and connections. Progress feels slow. Raises come in small steps. Promotions take longer than expected. You look at people further ahead and wonder whether you will ever close the gap. Then the next 4 years often begin to change everything. The experience you built starts becoming more valuable. Your credibility begins opening doors. Your network starts creating opportunities that never existed earlier. Every raise now stacks on top of a larger base, and income starts climbing faster than it did before. Then come the next 3 years, where growth can become dramatic. Senior positions start becoming realistic. Equity begins entering the picture. Consulting, leadership, and higher value opportunities appear. Your earning power starts curving upward in the same way an investment portfolio does when compounding finally becomes visible. A lot of people walk away right before this stage. They get frustrated during the slow early years, switch paths too quickly, reset their progress, and never stay in one lane long enough to reach the bend in the curve. They do with careers exactly what many investors do with money. That is why the 8-4-3 pattern matters beyond investing. It helps you see that frustration in the early stage is not always a sign that something is wrong. In many compounding systems, the beginning is supposed to feel slower than the end. Often, surviving that phase matters more than trying to perfectly optimize it. So here is the mindset shift that ties all of this together. Most people judge their investing progress by looking backward. They focus on how much they have gained so far, feel unimpressed, and compare themselves to giant numbers they see in financial media. That comparison makes them feel behind. The 8-4-3 rule suggests a better way to think. Stop asking only what your portfolio has done. Start asking what it is on track to become. Look forward instead of backward. Project what your current balance and current contribution rate could turn into over the next 15 or 20 years if you simply leave the system alone. In most cases, that forward view looks far more powerful than the backward one. What you have today may not look extraordinary, but what it can become, given enough time, absolutely is. In a sense, the wealth is already there in mathematical form. Yeah, it just has not arrived at the visible portion of the timeline yet, and the investor who understands that behaves differently. He stays patient during the slow years because he knows the pattern. He pushes hard on contributions because he understands how powerful those early dollars become later. He stays calm during volatility because he sees falling prices as an opportunity during the accumulation stage, not as a reason to panic. Most of all, he does not quit. He does not keep pulling money out. He does not tell himself compounding only works for other people. He keeps investing, keeps waiting, and allows the math to do exactly what it has always done. 8 years can feel painfully long when you are inside them. 4 years feels meaningful but manageable. 3 years passes faster than you expect. Then one day you look up and realize your portfolio is producing more in annual gains than you could realistically contribute yourself. And that is when the truth becomes obvious. Compounding was never slow, it was backloaded, and the magic was real.